Most people think healing is loud, crying, closure, conversations. But what if real healing is silence? There are wounds the world never sees. They don't bleed and they don't scream. They don't require stitches or sympathy. These wounds are quiet. They sit beneath the surface, buried in the soul like ancient ruins, whispering truths to the few who dare to stop and listen. Most run from this silence, terrified of what they might hear. But some, often unknowingly, are pulled toward it. Not because they are broken, but because something deeper in them knows this is where the real work begins. She was one of them, not defined by the pain itself, but by the strange clarity that followed it. When the noise of the world fell away, when the apologies never came, when the questions echoed in a room now empty, what remained was silence. And in that silence, a mirror. Not the kind that reflects your face, but the kind that reflects your shadow. Every woman who walks away from what once held her heart knows this moment. It's not rage, it's not even sorrow. It's something more hollow, more dangerous, detachment. The kind Viktor Frankl called tragic optimism, the ability to hold suffering in one hand and meaning in the other. It's not numbness, it's not defeat, it's evolution. And no one can recognize it unless they've stood at the edge of themselves and chosen not to jump, but to wait, to breathe, and to become. This is the terrain of the first silent wound, the wound of being unseen. Not ignored in the loud sense, but overlooked in the way that makes you doubt your very existence. The kind of neglect that feels like erasure, where your needs became too inconvenient, your voice too heavy, your love too much. And so you silenced yourself, not because you lacked strength, but because you were told, over time, that being quiet was safer than being abandoned. But being unseen does not mean you are invisible. It means your depth was simply too vast for shallow eyes. Frankl knew that human beings are not destroyed by suffering itself, but by suffering without meaning. And when you feel unseen, the pain becomes unbearable not because it hurts, but because it seems pointless. That's when the psyche fractures. That's when the shadow forms. Because without meaning, the mind builds its own, sometimes in the form of self-blame, obsession, or despair. But this is precisely where the second wound takes root, the wound of over-identification. You begin to think your trauma is your truth. You confuse emotional chaos with depth. You mistake being needed with being loved. And slowly, you shrink to fit the size of someone else's understanding. You become the role they assign to you, the caretaker, the savior, the broken one. But this is a false self, a mask, a psychic defense. And the moment you stop playing that role, people say you've changed. But the truth is, you've returned to yourself. Frankl once wrote that between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response, and in our response lies our growth and our freedom. That space, that holy silence, is where the third wound reveals itself, the wound of over-explaining. You tried to make them understand. You thought if you found the right words, the right tone, the perfect delivery, they would finally see you, finally value you, finally choose you. But you weren't explaining them. You were trying to explain yourself to the wound. And wounds do not speak the language of logic. They speak in patterns, in behaviors, in reactions disguised as choices. That's why healing feels like betrayal, because the part of you that loved dysfunction must die for the rest of you to live. This isn't philosophy, it's survival, it's soul work. It's the quiet revolution of a woman who chooses to feel everything, then detach from all of it. Not because she stopped caring, but because she started remembering her worth. And now, you're not listening to this by accident. Something in you, something sacred, has already begun to shift. The way you sit in your silence now feels different. Not like loneliness, but like listening. Not like loss, but like space. As if your soul is clearing the wreckage to build something beautiful, something only you can understand. The next wound is coming, not to destroy you, but to initiate you into a deeper self, into a quieter kind of power, into the beauty of pain. There is a kind of woman who carries storms in her chest and still chooses not to rage. She holds the weight of what was never said, never fixed, never acknowledged, and yet she walks on, not out of pride, but out of principle. She does not scream, she does not chase, she simply disappears, not from the world, but from the illusions that once tethered her spirit. This is where the fourth silent wound rises from the ashes, the wound of abandonment, not by others, but by the self. It's easy to blame the ones who left, who forgot, who took without giving. But the deeper betrayal happens long before they walk away. It begins the moment you silence your needs to maintain peace. The moment you tell yourself, this is enough, even when every cell in your body is screaming, this is not who I am. Frankl understood that meaning is not handed to us, it is created through choice. And sometimes the hardest choice is not to forgive others, but to forgive yourself for who you became just to be loved. You adapted, you minimized, you tolerated things your soul begged you to reject. You shaped yourself into a version of you that made their lives easier and your life emptier. Not out of weakness, but out of hope. You hoped they'd meet you halfway. You hoped they'd recognize the sacrifice, but they didn't. And that hope, unfulfilled, became its own kind of grief. Yet something strange happens in that grief, something rare. The body breaks, but the psyche starts to awaken. And in that awakening, the fifth wound arrives, the wound of awakening to illusion. Suddenly, the love you once romanticized feels manipulative. The intimacy feels transactional. The connection feels conditional. And you begin to question everything, not just about them, but about yourself. What parts of you were real, and what parts were armor? What emotions were yours, and what were inherited from a mother who didn't heal, from a father who didn't see, from a culture that only valued you when you were silent, small, or pleasing? The unraveling begins here, and it is terrifying, because to wake up means you can never go back to sleep. You can't unsee the patterns. You can't unfeel the void. But in that void, you find space. Space to rebuild. Space to ask the question that lives underneath every spiritual scar. Who am I when I am not what hurt me? Viktor Frankl did not teach people how to escape suffering. He taught them how to suffer meaningfully, how to find purpose in the pain, not for the sake of positivity or false strength, but to transform suffering into transcendence, into choice, into a mirror, so powerful it shatters every identity you once thought was. And yet, the most difficult mirror to face is silence. Not the kind where no one calls, but the kind where you stop calling, you stop performing, you stop proving, and for the first time, you sit in the emptiness, in the stillness, and you listen. You listen to what you really want. You listen to what you've outgrown. You listen to the woman beneath the pain, the one who never left, only dimmed her light so others could shine. Here enters the sixth wound, the wound of emotional detachment, not as avoidance, but as clarity. Because after the tears dry, after the fantasies burn, after the rage dissolves, what's left? You. Unattached, unapologetic, unimpressed. You no longer beg to be seen. You no longer negotiate your value. You no longer hand out access to those who never earned it. And they will notice. They always do. When your energy pulls away, when your eyes no longer seek theirs, when your words grow few and your boundaries grow firm, they will say you've changed, that you're cold, that you're cruel. But they are mistaking detachment for indifference. What you've found is not coldness. It is self-possession. You've found the silence of knowing, the peace of no longer performing, the rare, untouchable calm of a woman who no longer fears being misunderstood, because she finally understands herself. But the final wound, the seventh, is the most sacred, the wound of self-worth reclaimed. Because healing is not a return, it's a rebirth. You don't become who you were. You become who you were always meant to be before the world taught you otherwise. This wound bleeds the quietest, but heals the strongest, because it doesn't need an audience. It doesn't need closure. It doesn't need him to say sorry. It only needs you, whole, awakened, and free. There is something almost divine about the silence that follows true transformation. It doesn't announce itself with noise or celebration. It arrives like fog, slow, soft, and irreversible. And when it settles, you realize you are no longer the person who once begged for clarity, for validation, for love that cost you your voice. She no longer walks to be followed. She walks to return to herself. In Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, he wrote, "When we are no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves." But he was not speaking of shallow change, not the curated, polished social media kind of healing. He was referring to the quiet metamorphosis that begins when you stop waiting for life to return to what it was, and instead accept that it never will. The woman who has faced the 7 silent wounds does not return to the world seeking reward. She no longer hopes that someone will finally realize her worth. That season is gone. Now her eyes are clear, and they no longer search the room for someone to understand her. Her energy has become her sanctuary, her silence her signature. Because there is no longer a need to be seen when you finally see yourself. The feminine psyche, when wounded, either collapses inward or expands through the fire. And if it expands, if it refuses to be consumed, it becomes something mythic. The wound becomes the womb, and out of that dark silence is born a woman who does not explain, does not chase, and does not settle. Not because she is bitter, but because she is sovereign. Emotional detachment in this phase is not numbness, it is sacred distance. It is the space where the false self dies and the true self reclaims her throne. She no longer reacts, she reflects. She no longer explains, she embodies. She no longer waits, she chooses. And what she chooses now is peace. But peace is not the absence of pain, it is the presence of inner alignment. A kind of quiet that no longer depends on external circumstances, no longer trembles at rejection, no longer twists itself to be digestible. She has accepted the loneliness that comes with healing, because loneliness, when fully felt, becomes solitude. And in solitude, a new kind of strength is born. A Stoic strength, the kind Marcus Aurelius wrote of when he reminded us that you have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. This strength is not loud, it's not performative, it's not interested in proving itself. It's the strength of a woman who knows that just because someone didn't love her deeply doesn't mean she is unlovable. Just because she gave her best and it wasn't enough doesn't mean her best wasn't beautiful. Just because her story didn't end the way she prayed it would doesn't mean it didn't serve her becoming. Now she walks not with armor, but with awareness. She sees through manipulation. She recognizes emotional games. She notices when someone only reaches out to keep her orbit warm, not because they value her light, and she no longer plays along. Because she understands now, not everyone who enters your life is meant to stay. Some are meant to awaken you, to shatter the illusions that kept you bound, to wound you so precisely that you have no choice but to meet yourself. And that meeting, that sacred reckoning, is where true healing begins. Frankl's brilliance was never in teaching people to avoid suffering. It was in teaching them how to walk through it with dignity, to suffer meaningfully, to choose, even in despair, to create something beautiful from the ashes. And so she does. She paints again, not to be praised, but because her soul needs color. She writes again, not to be read, but because her story is worthy of ink. She dances again, not for eyes, but because her body remembers joy. This is what healing looks like when it is no longer performative. It's not a timeline, it's not linear, it's not even visible from the outside, but it is real. And you, sitting in the quiet now, holding your own silence like a sacred thing, you are already healing. You don't need to explain your scars. You don't need to justify your boundaries. You don't need to apologize for who you became in order to survive, because survival wasn't the end. It was the beginning. Somewhere along the journey of quiet healing, a sacred shift occurs. She stops asking, "Why did this happen to me?" and starts asking, "Who did I become because of it?" This is not a question born of resentment. It is not rhetorical. It is the voice of the soul, tired of performing, ready to reclaim. Pain, when faced with open eyes and open heart, no longer becomes an enemy. It becomes an instructor. The world has long misunderstood women who go silent. They are seen as bitter, dramatic, cold. But those who truly know silence know better. They know that silence is not an absence. It is a language, a boundary, a baptism. She stopped responding not because she didn't care, but because she had already said everything her soul needed to say. When words become futile, silence becomes sacred. And this sacred silence is not passive. It is defiant. It is a revolution cloaked in stillness. This is the part of healing no one teaches, the part where no one claps for you, no one cheers, no one even notices. Because the most important chapters of your story are written in solitude. You begin to release things that once defined you, the relationships, the roles, the repeating cycles. And at first, this release feels like death. The death of hope, the death of identity. But Frankl knew something most people miss. To say yes to life, you must also say yes to loss. Because what we lose is often the weight that was keeping us from flight. And she is beginning to fly now. Not outwardly, not flamboyantly, but inwardly, in the small, quiet decisions that redefine the entire axis of her being. She starts saying no without explanation. She starts saying yes to things that nourish her instead of depleting her. And most profoundly, she stops asking to be chosen. Because she has already chosen herself. This is not arrogance. This is not rage. This is returning. Returning to the self that existed before the first wound. Before the first apology she never received. Before the first compromise that felt like self-betrayal. And now, something luminous emerges. Something unshakable. She is no longer seeking closure. She has become it. She no longer craves answers. She carries peace in not knowing. She no longer wants to be saved. She has found salvation in her own resilience. Frankl's Logotherapy taught us that meaning can be found in even the most desolate places, that suffering can be transformed into strength if we choose the right attitude toward it. And this woman, the one who walked through heartbreak, abandonment, rejection, betrayal, she now carries a deeper kind of grace, the kind that can't be faked, the kind that can't be stolen. Grace born from having nothing left to lose except the illusion that she was ever unworthy. This grace shows up in subtle ways, in how she no longer fills silences with nervous laughter, in how she no longer entertains conversations that drain her, in how she no longer proves her worth to people committed to misunderstanding her. Because healing, in its purest form, is the return of dignity. It's the moment you look at your scars and stop wishing them away and start thanking them for shaping you. It's the shift from needing to be chosen to knowing you are whole even when you're alone. And now the world feels different, not because the world has changed, but because you have. You no longer see pain as punishment. You see it as alchemy. You no longer flinch at loneliness. You see it as a portal. You no longer carry the weight of other people's expectations. You carry your own truth, and it's finally enough. This is the woman who does not yell. She whispers her truth through actions. She moves with soft power. She lets go without drama. She rises without needing to be seen. Because the most dangerous kind of woman is the one who remembers who she is in silence. There is a quiet revolution unfolding in the hearts of those who choose healing without applause. No one witnesses the first day she wakes up and no longer aches for a message that will never come. No one sees the precise moment she walks past the memory without looking back. But she knows, and that is enough. Because the soul keeps score in silence. Viktor Frankl once described suffering as a uniquely human capacity, not just to endure, but to transform. In every wound, he believed, there lies a possibility, the possibility to rise with deeper meaning, not despite the pain, but through it. And she, the woman no longer afraid of her silence, has started to see the map in her scars. The architecture of her growth is written in everything that tried to break her. Now she sees clearly. The love that left wasn't love. It was attachment. The people she lost weren't hers. They were mirrors meant to reveal what still needed healing. And the story she once told herself that she wasn't enough, wasn't seen, wasn't chosen, is fading into the quiet truth. She was always enough. They just weren't ready. But healing is not a linear unfolding. It loops. It returns. It tempts her to repeat the past just to feel something familiar. It whispers, maybe if you give more, they'll come back. Maybe if you shrink a little, they'll stay. And she almost listens. Almost. But not this time. Because pain taught her presence. Silence taught her boundaries. And absence taught her who was truly aligned with her soul, not just her image. This is where the soul enters the realm of spiritual detachment. Not apathy, not avoidance, but the powerful decision to release what was never hers to hold. She no longer clings to what doesn't nurture her. She no longer confuses longing with loyalty. In the language of Stoicism, she has embraced amor fati, the love of one's fate, even the hard parts, especially the hard parts, because it was the breaking that revealed her edges, the loss that unveiled her capacity to let go, the rejection that taught her she was never meant to be where her spirit felt small. She is no longer at war with reality. She no longer fights for a version of the past where everything made sense. She no longer performs for an audience that applauds her silence only when it serves their comfort. She is silent now, yes, but not the silence of suppression, the silence of sovereignty. And in that sovereignty, she begins to live differently. She no longer asks, "Do they love me?" but instead asks, "Does this honor my soul?" She no longer waits to be invited. She creates space for herself. She no longer carries guilt for choosing peace over performance. Because peace for her is no longer optional. It is non-negotiable. There is a sacred kind of exhaustion that comes after healing, a fatigue not from pain, but from pretending. And once she sheds the armor, she begins to see beauty again, not in the way things look, but in the way they feel. The sun becomes more golden, the silence becomes more melodic, her own company becomes more than enough. This is the woman who knows the weight of every wound. She does not glamorize suffering, but she no longer fears it. She does not chase love, she radiates it. And the people meant for her now recognize it not in her words, but in her energy. Because when you heal deeply, you no longer attract those who need your wounds. You attract those who honor your healing. Frankl taught that when life presents suffering, the most powerful response is to find meaning. And meaning, in its purest form, is found not in the explanation, but in the becoming.
She has become, not because the pain vanished, but because it refined her. She is not whole because she was never broken. She is whole because she faced the illusion of brokenness and saw through it. And now, the silence no longer hurts. It holds her. The past no longer defines her. It shaped her. The future no longer scares her. She trusts it. Because the woman who walks alone is not lost. She is walking home. Somewhere between letting go and moving on, she realized the truth. She was never asking too much. She was simply asking the wrong people. And in that moment of clarity, not loud, not dramatic, something ancient awakened inside her. A knowing. A remembering. The kind of shift that doesn't need to be spoken to be felt. This is what Viktor Frankl meant when he spoke of the last of human freedoms, the freedom to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances. And she had chosen. Not revenge, not resentment, not performance, but peace. True peace. The kind that is earned only through the fire. The kind that comes after you've been cracked open by grief, hollowed out by longing, and left to rebuild with your bare hands. Alone. But the woman who rebuilds in silence becomes indestructible, because silence in the aftermath of pain becomes more than stillness. It becomes a teacher, a filter, a guide. And she now walks by that compass, not by pressure, not by guilt, not by fear. There's a particular kind of grief that never cries. It doesn't throw things, it doesn't beg to be understood. It simply sits in the chest like a storm that never touches ground. She carried that grief for years, maybe decades. And yet she smiled, she performed, she held it all together because that's what the world taught her to do. But now she is no longer interested in holding it together. She is interested in letting it fall apart, because sometimes destruction is divine. Sometimes the falling is the becoming. In Jungian shadow work, the self cannot be complete until it embraces what was once repressed. And this woman, this healer in silence, has begun to reclaim all the parts of herself she once exiled. The wildness, the anger, the softness, the desire, the sadness that lingered just beneath her laughter, the rage that lived behind her compassion. She no longer fears the mess, because she knows now the mess is honest. And honesty, even if ugly, is the birthplace of real connection, first with the self, then with the world. So she stops hiding. She stops saying yes to be liked. She stops apologizing for the ways she has changed, because she did not come this far just to shrink again. Now her presence alone speaks louder than her voice ever could. When she enters a room, she doesn't compete. She simply is. Whole, grounded, clear. People sense it. They feel it in how she doesn't flinch when misunderstood, in how she doesn't chase, doesn't overshare, doesn't perform empathy to earn belonging. She simply exists and lets her energy speak the truth. And the truth is this: she is no longer afraid to be alone. Because solitude, once feared as abandonment, has become her most honest mirror. In solitude, she found clarity. In clarity, she found purpose. And in purpose, she found herself. Frankl said that those who have a why to live can bear almost any how. And this woman, no longer defined by her pain, has found her why, not in a man, not in a dream, not in being needed, but in being real. Her why is her freedom. Her why is her self-worth. Her why is the quiet, fierce devotion to never abandon herself again. Not for love, not for approval, not for the illusion of connection. She would rather walk alone in truth than walk with anyone in pretense. And that, perhaps, is the final evolution of the soul after trauma. Not the return to joy, but the rise into sovereignty. She has become the woman who sees through everything, who listens more than she speaks, who walks away without burning bridges, not because she's afraid, but because she doesn't need to destroy what she no longer depends on. Her detachment is not coldness, it is spiritual intelligence. Her silence is not weakness, it is her protection, her temple, her language of discernment. This is not just healing, this is transcendence. This is the kind of transformation that can't be captured in words, only in energy. Only in the way she no longer flinches at being misunderstood, no longer bleeds for those who never learned how to hold their own wounds. The world hasn't changed, but she has. And now she belongs to herself.
There comes a moment, often unnoticed by others, but unforgettable to the soul, when she no longer needs to win the war. Not because she surrenders, but because she outgrows the battlefield. The ache to be right, to be seen, to be chosen, it fades. Not out of defeat, but from wisdom, from wariness, from sacred clarity. This is the silent liberation. Not the kind that explodes into a new life, but the kind that subtly rewrites the way she breathes, the way she carries herself, the way she stops explaining her softness, her distance, her decisions. She is no longer asking the world to understand her. She is asking herself to remember her. This is what happens when a woman stops living through her wounds and starts living through her worth. It didn't happen suddenly. The shift came like the tide, inch by inch, erosion by erosion, pulling back everything that no longer belonged to her spirit. Friends who only stayed close when she dimmed her light. Lovers who fed on her vulnerability but never fed her soul. Situations she used to justify with loyalty, though they drained her life force. They all fell away. And for a while she felt hollow. Not broken, just emptied. Of illusions, of roles, of expectations. And in that emptiness, something pure began to grow. Inner self-respect. Not the loud kind plastered in self-help slogans, the quiet kind that changes how you sit with yourself when no one's watching. The kind that softens your voice and sharpens your boundaries. The kind that stops you from shrinking to be palatable. She's not here to be palatable anymore. She's here to be true. This truth, it doesn't make her louder, it makes her quieter, more intentional, more discerning. Because now she understands. Not everyone deserves access to her inner world. Not everyone is meant to understand her depth. And not everyone who says, "I love you," is speaking from love. Sometimes they are speaking from need, from control, from fear. She no longer confuses those things with care. And in this new awareness, something else shifts. She stops needing closure. Not because she's fully healed, but because she finally accepts that some things will never make sense. Some people will never apologize. Some chapters will never be rewritten. And that's okay. The story doesn't need to change for her to change. Viktor Frankl wrote that suffering ceases to be suffering the moment it finds meaning. And the meaning is not always grand, not always poetic. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes the meaning is, I deserved better, and now I will give it to myself. That's enough. That's powerful. That's healing. It's how she begins to treat her time like gold, her energy like sacred fire, her body like holy ground. She no longer seeks out distractions to fill the silence, because now she honors it. She no longer reacts to every trigger, because she's no longer ruled by the parts of her that ache for validation. She belongs to herself now. And it shows in the way she doesn't over-explain when someone disrespects her, in the way she walks away without a speech, in the way she listens to her own nervous system and says no, not from fear, but from wisdom. Because the woman who heals does not become softer for others. She becomes softer with herself. And she becomes stronger in the way she protects that softness. This is the paradox of healing. You become more tender and more untouchable at the same time.
more open and less available, more compassionate and less compromising, more loving and less tolerant of what depletes you. Frankl's teaching was not about avoiding suffering, but about enduring it with purpose, transcending it with freedom. And that's what she carries now, not just a healed heart, but a refined soul. She is no longer waiting for life to return to what it was. She's no longer romanticizing the past or fearing the future. She is here, fully, with herself, as she is, in all her layers. Not perfect, not unscarred, but sovereign. And in her sovereignty, she no longer needs to be understood, because she understands herself. Healing, when it finally reaches the marrow, doesn't come with fireworks. It comes with stillness. The kind of stillness that feels like both a graveyard and a garden. Something has died, yes, but something else has begun to live. She walks slower now, not because she's weak, but because she no longer rushes through her own becoming. She sees now most people don't fear being alone. They fear meeting the parts of themselves that surface in solitude. But she has sat with her ghosts. She's broken bread with her shame. And in that uncomfortable intimacy with the shadow, she found her light, not as an escape, but as integration. Because true wholeness is not about light defeating darkness. It's about the two coexisting in harmony. The woman who has endured silent wounds no longer measures her growth by the absence of pain. She measures it by her response to it. Where she once shattered, she now steadies. Where she once lashed out, she now leans in. Not to be a saint, but to be sovereign. She is sovereign now in the most sacred way, not because she controls everything, but because she no longer needs to. This is what Viktor Frankl meant when he described the defiant power of the human spirit, the capacity to choose meaning over misery, the quiet rebellion of refusing to let external chaos contaminate internal peace. And now her life is shaped not by urgency, but by intention. She doesn't chase, she doesn't beg, she doesn't cling, because anything she has to beg to keep is already gone. Letting go is no longer an act of loss. It's an act of power, a decision not to abandon herself again. Now her relationships mirror her worth, not because they're perfect, but because they're honest. She no longer entertains connections that drain her, not because she's heartless, but she's healed. And healing rewrites the rules. It changes what you tolerate. It changes what you recognize as love. Because love without respect is a performance. Love without safety is a prison. Love without reciprocity is a wound disguised as warmth. She sees through all of it now, not with bitterness, with clarity. And clarity is the gift of the wounded woman who chose to heal. Not to be better than anyone, not to become a symbol, but to finally be free. This freedom isn't loud, it's not flashy. It looks like sleeping well, like not needing to explain yourself in every room, like walking away when your peace costs too much. It looks like saying no without guilt, like feeling joy without permission, like honoring your own voice above the noise of expectation. And here, in this space of self-honoring, she meets a new kind of silence. Not the silence of pain, but the silence of peace. It is not empty. It is not lonely. It is holy. This silence holds her the way no one else ever did. It reflects her back to herself. It whispers not just who she is, but who she's always been. Before the world told her she was too much, too soft, too emotional, too complicated. She is not too much. She is exact. And anyone who cannot hold that is not meant to hold her. This is not cruelty. This is clarity. Frankl reminded us that life is never made unbearable by circumstances, but by a lack of meaning and purpose. She has found both, not in grand visions, but in the quiet, everyday choices that realign her with herself. She drinks her coffee slower now. She walks barefoot in places that used to terrify her. She listens to music she once turned off because it reminded her of someone who no longer lives in her heart. Not because the pain is gone, but because she no longer resists it. She knows now healing is not about erasing the past. It's about no longer letting the past erase you. She is here, fully, finally, and no one, not even the ones who left her bleeding, can take that away.
There is a rare kind of beauty in a woman who no longer flinches, not because she has hardened, but because she has softened so deeply into herself that nothing external can fracture her. Not silence, not rejection, not absence. Because she no longer interprets those things as reflections of her worth, only reflections of the other's capacity to meet her. And that is a kind of emotional wisdom that cannot be taught, only earned through the sacred violence of becoming. This is what Viktor Frankl meant when he spoke of tragic optimism, the ability to hold space for suffering and still choose life. Not naively, not blindly, but with the steady hand of someone who has danced with despair and chosen to rise anyway. Not because it's easy, but because staying small became more painful than growing. She doesn't romanticize her wounds anymore. She reveres them. Because every wound was a doorway, every heartbreak a mirror, every loss a sacred redirection. And she no longer asks, "Why me?" She asks, "What now? What will I create from this? What will I protect next time? What will I no longer betray in myself to be loved?" This is the architecture of post-traumatic growth, the moment where she stops surviving and starts sculpting. Sculpting boundaries from old betrayals, sculpting self-worth from old abandonment, sculpting clarity from the fog that once kept her chasing things that only dimmed her. She doesn't chase anymore. She doesn't beg anymore. She doesn't prove anymore. Because there's nothing to prove when you know your value. When you've rebuilt your inner home from ashes and silence and sleepless nights. When you've held your own hand through panic and flashbacks and the terrifying quiet of being unseen and didn't give up. She doesn't ask, "What if I'm not enough?" She knows the answer. She always was. They just didn't have the eyes to see it. And that's no longer her burden to carry. Now she is careful, not guarded, just aware. She knows the cost of giving herself away too quickly. She knows the damage of over-explaining to someone committed to misunderstanding her. She knows that her peace is expensive, and not everyone is wealthy enough in spirit to afford it. So she becomes more selective, not out of fear, out of reverence. Because when you've almost lost yourself once, you learn to protect your soul like a sacred artifact. You learn that not everyone is meant to see your softness. Not everyone deserves access to your light. And those who do, those rare few who carry their own depth, who know how to hold without gripping, to love without possessing, they will recognize her not by her beauty, but by her stillness. Stillness is her new language. It says, "I don't need to convince you." It says, "I've already heard all the lies. I choose truth now, even when it's lonely." It says, "I am not interested in potential. I'm aligned with presence." This is where silence becomes sacred, not a void, but a vessel. A space where meaning can finally land, where the noise of the world no longer drowns out the wisdom within. Because the woman who once begged for answers now creates her own. She walks away from chaos not because she's angry, but because she's tired. She says no without flinching because peace is more important than approval. She sits with her discomfort, not to escape it, but to hear what it's trying to teach her. And in that, she becomes untouchable. Not because she's invulnerable, but because she has befriended her vulnerability. She no longer fears breaking open, because she knows now breaking is how the light gets in, and how her own light gets out. Frankl said, "What is to give light must endure burning." And she has burned.
But what rose from the ashes is not a victim, not even a survivor. What rose is a creator of meaning, of boundaries, of beauty, of a life sculpted not from fantasy, but from truth. And that truth, raw, holy, unshakable, now lives in everything she touches. There's a shift so quiet even she almost missed it. It happens one morning, perhaps while brushing her teeth or watching the sky dissolve from night to dawn, when she realizes she hasn't thought about him. Not in days. Not in the way she used to. The memory has softened. The ache has dulled. The thread that once pulled her back into the past has frayed. She does not celebrate. She does not cry. She just breathes, deeper than she has in years. Because healing rarely comes as thunder. It arrives like breath, like space, like a moment where you are finally fully present and you don't feel haunted. That's when you know the wound has turned into wisdom. Frankl taught that between stimulus and response, there is a space, and in that space lies our power to choose. She has expanded that space. Once she would have reacted. Now she waits, she watches. She listens not just to the words but to her body, to her intuition, to the soft tremor beneath her skin that whispers, "This is not for you." And when something is not for her, she no longer fights to make it hers, because she has learned what's meant for her will never require self-abandonment. She is not impressed by intensity anymore. She is not seduced by potential. She no longer confuses chaos for chemistry or control for care. What moves her now is consistency, stillness, presence, the subtle gestures that feel safe instead of intoxicating, the people who show up slowly and mean it, the ones who speak her name not as a possession, but as a privilege. She has become discerning, not closed, not hard, discerning. Because when your heart has been torn open by illusion, you learn to see clearly. You learn to hear what's unspoken, to recognize when someone is feeding from your light instead of feeding it. And you walk away, not because you're cold, but because you're done bleeding for people who bring knives instead of hands. There's nothing left to fix in them. There's only everything left to love in you. And you, who once gave all your energy to being chosen, now realize you are the one who chooses. You are the gate. You are the standard. You are the home you kept building in others. And no one else can give you what you've already decided to become. Now your rituals are different. You wake up and ask not, "Who will love me today?" but "How can I love myself better today?" You rest not as reward, but as rebellion against a world that told you your worth was in your output. You do not perform softness to be loved. You live in your softness because it's your nature, and only those who are safe with your softness may stay. And some will say you've changed. They'll say you're distant, cold, aloof. But they're wrong. You're just centered. You've stopped orbiting other people's needs. You've stopped silencing your voice to maintain false harmony. You've stopped lowering your standards so you don't scare away those who were never capable of rising. This is not ego. This is energetic hygiene. This is the woman who now knows the difference between connection and enmeshment, between giving and overgiving, between being kind and being consumed. And she protects that knowing like a flame in the wind, because Frankl's wisdom lives in her bones now. The meaning she sought was never out there. It was always here, in how she held herself when the world turned away, in how she alchemized rejection into redirection, in how she stopped trying to make people stay and started making herself safe to come home to. She is home now, not just in her house, in her breath, in her boundaries, in her body, the same one she once apologized for, starved, punished, ignored. Now she dresses not to be seen, but to be felt by herself. She speaks not to please, but to express. She loves not to possess, but to nourish. She is no longer trying to become someone. She is simply unbecoming everything that was never hers to carry. And what remains is truth, is power, is peace. She once believed peace was something to be earned, a reward at the end of suffering, something given to the obedient, the quiet, the forgiving. But now she knows better. Peace is not given. Peace is chosen. Peace is built, moment by moment, breath by breath, boundary by boundary. And sometimes building peace means tearing down everything that once kept her chained, to roles, to stories, to identities that demanded her silence. Frankl taught that even in the bleakest conditions, we possess the ability to choose our response, that our dignity cannot be taken, only surrendered. She knows this now in her bones. Dignity is not found in being agreeable. It's not found in pleasing others. It's found in the quiet refusal to betray oneself ever again. So she stopped apologizing for her evolution. She no longer sugarcoats her no. She no longer performs softness to calm the discomfort in others. Because softness, when real, is not decoration, it's power. It's the softness of ocean tides, quiet, yes, but strong enough to move the earth. And now, when she speaks, the room shifts. Not because her voice is loud, but because it lands, grounded, embodied, precise. She no longer speaks to be heard by everyone. She speaks to echo truth within herself. And if it resonates with others, good. If not, so be it. She has nothing left to prove. She has nothing left to hide. Her silence is not a void. It is her fortress. It's where she retreats when the world becomes too hungry for pieces of her she no longer gives away for free. And those who loved her for her compliance, they begin to drift. They call her cold. They call her selfish. They call her changed. They're right. She has changed. She is no longer addicted to being the one who stays, the one who fixes, the one who proves her love by her suffering. She is no longer available for roles that require her disappearance. She is no longer seduced by people who only love her when she is silent. Now she listens more than she responds, watches more than she reacts, protects more than she performs. Her energy is no longer on sale. She has become rare, not because she seeks to be, but because she chose to stop diluting herself to be digestible. And when you stop diluting your truth, you stop drowning in their comfort. This is what freedom feels like. Not the kind that shouts, but the kind that settles. Settles into her spine, into her breath, into the way she walks into a room without scanning for permission to exist. Settles into the way she no longer dreams of being rescued, because she has rescued herself. Into the way she no longer fantasizes about the person who hurt her realizing what they lost, because she no longer feels lost within herself. Into the way she no longer looks for closure, because she became the closure. She became the final page. She became the exit and the arrival. Because meaning, as Frankl revealed, is not something handed to us by others. It's something we construct from our suffering. Something we carve from confusion, something we forge in the dark. And in the quietest corners of that darkness, where no applause echoed, where no eyes watched, she built herself. She built herself from every betrayal she thought would break her. She built herself from every night she wept alone, praying to be enough. She built herself from silence, and not the hollow kind, the sacred kind. The kind that heals what words never could. And now, she no longer needs to be remembered by them, because she finally remembers herself.
There's a beauty in a woman who no longer seeks revenge, not because she forgets, but because she remembers differently. She remembers not through pain, but through wisdom, not through longing, but through clarity. She remembers what she endured, what she gave, what she lost, and most of all, what she reclaimed. And that reclamation, it didn't come from another's apology. It didn't arrive through a conversation or an answer or a returned call in the middle of the night. It came in stillness, in one breath, in one private holy moment when she realized, I am no longer waiting. Not for them to see, not for them to change, not for them to say the words she already deserved. Because waiting is a form of spiritual exile, and she has come home. Viktor Frankl understood this rebirth. He knew that survival is not the goal, meaning is. And meaning cannot be found in places that require her to disappear. So she no longer looks to others to validate her experience. Her pain is valid. Her grief is sacred. Her silence is not weakness. It is a meditation, a prayer, a rebellion. And in that silence, she has come face to face with her worth. Not the kind built from compliments or followers or rings on fingers, but the kind that rises when no one is clapping. The kind that lives in the spine, steady, unfaltering. She doesn't walk the same anymore. There's a groundedness in her that unnerves the unhealed. There's a calmness that feels like a challenge to those who mistake noise for power. And there's a softness in her that radiates not because she's trying to be lovable, but because she finally loves herself in ways that require no permission. She holds herself now, not as a reaction to pain, but as a devotion to peace. And that peace is costly. Not everyone will afford it. Not everyone will know what to do with a woman who doesn't explain her boundaries, doesn't justify her distance, doesn't chase after disappearing affection. But that's no longer her concern. Because the moment she stopped asking, "What did I do wrong?" and started asking, "What am I willing to do right by me?" everything changed. She stopped performing empathy for those who weaponized her compassion. She stopped contorting her truth to keep someone else's comfort intact. She stopped mistaking chaos for chemistry and silence for rejection. Now, silence is her sanctuary. It's where she goes to hear herself think, to touch her spirit, to heal what still stings and honor what still lives. It's where she no longer entertains old patterns dressed as new people. Where she no longer needs loud declarations to know when love is true. Because real love is consistent. It doesn't confuse. It doesn't vanish. It doesn't punish. And she, the woman forged in quiet grief, no longer chases what runs from her. She blesses it. She lets it go. Because she is no longer afraid of loss. Loss is how she found herself. Pain is how she refined herself. And solitude, that once terrifying mirror, is now where she sees the clearest version of her soul. Frankl once said that when we are no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves. And that is the core of her transformation. She stopped waiting for them to get it. She got it herself. She realized she was never too emotional. She was just surrounded by people afraid of their own depth. She was never too much. She was just more than they were capable of holding. She was never asking for the impossible. She was asking for presence, for safety, for truth. And when it wasn't given, she gave it to herself. Now, she writes her own endings. She no longer waits to be released. She releases herself. With grace. With finality. With no need for closure. Because she is the closing chapter and the beginning of the next. The ones who lost her may never know what they lost. And that, too, is part of her freedom. Because she no longer needs them to understand. She understands herself.
There is a stillness that arrives when a woman finally stops trying to be understood. Not because she's bitter, not because she's given up, but because she no longer seeks validation from those committed to misreading her. And in that stillness, she begins to hear something else, her own voice. It's softer now, but deeper, like roots growing under a forest after fire, silent, steady, undeniable. For years, she lived in performance, performing perfection, performance of healing, even the performance of detachment. She smiled through sorrow, laughed through loss. She didn't lie, but she didn't reveal. She became the strong one, the one who always came back, always forgave, always gave another chance. But strength without rest becomes armor, and she got tired of bleeding underneath her armor while being praised for wearing it. So she took it off, piece by piece, thought by thought, expectation by expectation. And beneath the armor, she met herself, bruised, tender, real. It's strange how the realest parts of us are often the most hidden. She wasn't hiding to deceive. She was hiding to survive. But survival is no longer her metric. Now, she chooses truth, even when it costs connection, even when it invites solitude, even when it shatters who she thought she needed to be. Frankl believed that when suffering becomes unavoidable, we are called not to despair, but to find a deeper purpose through it. And that purpose is not always grand. Sometimes it's simply learning to sit with yourself without needing to escape. She has learned this, and in doing so, she's changed the way she relates to everything, her past, her pain, even her future. She no longer rushes the process. She no longer begs for the ending. She no longer performs for clarity. She waits for it to rise. And it does. In dreams. In sudden knowings. In the calm that comes when you finally realize you're not broken. You were just breaking through a version of yourself that no longer fit. Now her energy is less scattered, less urgent, less hungry. She has fed the parts of herself that were starving, the parts that wanted to be seen, the parts that wanted to be held, the parts that screamed through silence for someone to just stay. She stays now, with herself, through every mood, every wave, every trigger, every revelation, every soft ache that lingers long after the world says she should have moved on. She doesn't move on anymore. She moves through, with reverence, with grace, with eyes wide open. And because of this, she no longer accepts halfway love. She no longer entertains people who text when they're lonely and disappear when she's vulnerable. She no longer leaks energy into situations that dishonor her soul, not because she's angry, because she's aware. There's a difference between being hard to love and hard to manipulate. She knows which one she is, and the ones who could not love her softness were simply not strong enough to sit with their own. Now, she walks with the kind of quiet confidence that only comes from real work, not surface healing, not affirmation bandages, but the raw, bloody work of looking your trauma in the face and saying, "You will not define me." And trauma doesn't like being seen. It fights. It clings. It lies. It tells you you're unlovable, too much, too broken, too late. But she has stopped listening.
She listens instead to the voice underneath, the one trauma tried to bury. The one that says, "You are not your mistakes. You are not your pain. You are not your abandonment. You are not their inability to love you. You are your comeback. You are your tenderness. You are your boundaries. You are the woman who stayed when no one else did." Frankl once said, "Suffering ceases to be suffering the moment it finds meaning." She has found hers, and it sounds like silence, and it feels like home. The most powerful women don't walk into a room to be noticed. They walk in with a presence that makes everything pause. It's not the way they speak, it's the way they don't have to. It's not the things they say, it's the things they no longer feel the need to explain. This is the woman who has survived herself, her old patterns, her unhealed cravings, her desire to be chosen even when it meant abandoning her voice. She has stopped chasing the echo of love in others. She has become the source. What once felt like rejection now feels like redirection. What once felt like abandonment now feels like realignment. What kept her up at night now gives her peace, because she finally understands. If they could not meet her, they were never meant to walk beside her. This is not a story of bitterness. This is a story of birth, of shedding skins, of breaking illusions, of facing the parts of herself she once labeled too emotional, too intense, too vulnerable, and calling them sacred. Frankl's vision of meaning was not built on avoidance. It was forged through fire. And she has walked through her own flames, not untouched, but transformed. Now, when the ghosts of her past rise to whisper, "You were not enough," she smiles, not out of arrogance, but recognition. She knows them well. She once believed them. She once shrank for them. But now, she thanks them, because those ghosts were her teachers. Those ghosts pushed her into solitude, and in solitude, she found her source. She is no longer hungry for a love that needs explanation. She is no longer addicted to people who confused possession with protection. She is no longer seduced by the idea that her softness must be earned or tamed. Now, she meets herself in the mirror and sees completion, not someone waiting to be finished by another. She is not a half. She is not waiting. She is not hoping that someone else will give her what she now fiercely gives to herself. Safety, stillness, sovereignty. She walks the world differently now. Slow, certain, not guarded, but protected by wisdom. She knows that to love deeply, you must first hold yourself deeply. That to be met in your fullness, you must first refuse to abandon any piece of your truth. And so she guards her peace not with walls, but with discernment. She does not entertain what triggers her into performance. She does not explain herself to those who do not ask with care. She does not romanticize what asks her to bleed for belonging, because she remembers what it cost to finally come home to herself. Frankl said, "Each man is questioned by life, and he can only answer to life by answering for his own life." This way of being, of choosing, of not reacting, this is her answer. It is quiet, it is rooted, it is deliberate,
and it is powerful beyond measure. She is no longer the woman who needs to be saved. She is the woman who knows how to sit in the fire and make it sacred. She is the woman who does not flinch when the silence comes, because the silence is not empty anymore. It is alive. It holds her. It protects her. It sings to her in a language deeper than words. The woman who once broke from being unseen now thrives in her invisibility. Not because she hides, but because she no longer needs to be watched to feel real. She is real. Here. Now.
There is a moment, always private, when a woman touches the final layer of her own silence and realizes she is no longer waiting to be rescued. Not by love, not by closure, not by time, and certainly not by the very people who once broke her. She no longer needs to be chosen because she has already chosen herself. This choosing is not a declaration. It is not loud. It doesn't need witnesses. It is in the way she returns to herself every time something threatens to pull her away. It is in the way she pauses before reacting, breathes before responding, checks in with her truth before betraying it for the sake of peace. Because now her peace is not negotiable. It's not a gift she hands out. It's a sanctuary she protects. Viktor Frankl knew that even in the midst of horror, a person could choose how they meet life. She has chosen to meet it with dignity. Not the kind that performs, not the kind that pretends, but the kind that allows her to weep when she needs to, rest when she must, and still rise with quiet, unshakable strength. She used to equate strength with pushing through. Now she equates it with alignment, with knowing when to stop, when to walk away, when to let something die so she can finally live. She is no longer afraid of death anymore, not the literal kind, but the metaphorical deaths we endure when we outgrow versions of ourselves we clung to out of fear. She has buried many things: old identities, unreciprocated love, false hopes, worn-out dreams, and in their place she has grown gardens of truth, of trust, of sacred solitude. She doesn't speak of her transformation often because she knows not everyone will understand. Most people want to see scars, not the healing that happens beneath the skin. Most people want a story with villains and triumphs, not the quiet truth of becoming. But her becoming wasn't a battle. It was a remembering, a slow, sacred peeling away of everything that was never hers. She doesn't want revenge. She doesn't want recognition. She doesn't want them to come back and say, "You were right." She wants nothing from them. That is her power. That is her healing, because freedom is not found in being right. It's found in releasing the need to be right. It's found in waking up and no longer feeling like you need to check someone else's temperature to decide how warm your heart can be that day. It's found in choosing your own voice over their silence, your own breath over their noise, your own path over their approval. And that path, it's unfamiliar, it's quiet, but it is hers. It winds through discomfort, past the ghosts of who she used to be, into landscapes she never knew existed because she was always busy surviving. But now she walks slowly, deliberately, not because she is lost, but because she is finally present. She is present in her body, present in her truth, present in her life. And that presence, it heals her more than love, more than time, more than anyone else ever could. Frankl wrote that the last of human freedoms is the ability to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances. She has chosen, and in that choice, she has reclaimed her story. It is not a tragedy. It is not a love story.
It is not a cautionary tale. It is a sacred return to herself, to her voice, to her meaning, to the place where she no longer needs to be found because she is no longer lost. She is whole. She is home. And she is finally, deeply free. There's a sacred finality in a woman who has reclaimed herself, not the kind marked by grand gestures or shouted affirmations, but the kind you feel in her presence, a presence that no longer asks, "Will you stay?" A presence that now whispers, "I stayed for myself." And that is enough. She used to hand out her loyalty like lifeboats, saving others, drowning herself. Now she walks away without the need to be chased. Not from pride, from peace. Because when you've carried your own heart through the rubble of grief, through the suffocating weight of silence, through the echoes of someone saying they loved you while abandoning you in the same breath, you learn something unshakable. You were never meant to beg for what should have been sacred. She is not harder now. She is not colder. She is clearer. And clarity is its own kind of fire. It burns away illusion. It scorches old patterns. It severs the ties that once tethered her to her unworthiness. This is what it means to outgrow pain. Not to deny it, not to erase it, but to stand taller in spite of it. Because she's no longer living through her wounds, she's living through her wisdom. And that wisdom, it doesn't apologize, it doesn't wait, it doesn't shapeshift to fit rooms that cannot hold it. Now she is no longer seduced by the idea that healing will bring her back to who she was before the pain. She doesn't want to be that version of herself. That version tolerated too much, explained too often, gave too freely. She is not going back. She is moving forward, lighter, wiser, sovereign. And perhaps the most radical thing about her now is not her independence, but her gentleness. Not the performative kind, the embodied kind. The kind that doesn't ask for softness from others, but radiates it regardless. The kind that no longer seeks protection through control, but through presence. She's learned that being hard isn't strength, it's a trauma reflex. True strength is being able to sit in the rawness of emotion without needing to escape. True strength is being able to say, "This hurt me, but I will not let it make me hard." And that's what makes her dangerous now, not in cruelty, but in clarity. She doesn't seek to hurt, but she will never again allow herself to be hurt in the same way. That part of her, the girl who waited by the phone, who kept forgiving, who believed love could heal what responsibility should, has been laid to rest, mourned, honored, released. Because the woman standing now is not here to be chosen. She is here to choose. Who gets access? Who gets closeness? Who earns the right to witness her vulnerability, not as a right, but as a gift? She understands now her energy is sacred. Her silence is not emptiness. Her solitude is not loneliness. It is liberation. She spends more time alone now, not because she's isolating, but because she's cultivating, rebuilding the parts of her life that were once built around proving herself. She no longer attends every argument she's invited to. She no longer justifies her peace to the chaotic. She no longer feels the need to remind anyone of what they lost, because she hasn't lost anything. She has gained everything. This is what Frankl meant by transcending suffering through meaning, not by avoiding life's pain, but by extracting something sacred from it. She's no longer ashamed of what broke her, because what broke her also built her. And now she is the kind of woman who no longer fits in cages, even golden ones. She will not shrink to be held. She will not silence herself to be loved.
She will not bend for comfort when her truth stands tall. She has loved and lost. She has wept and waited. She has shattered and rebuilt. And now she rises, not for applause, not for closure, not for validation. She rises for herself.
There's a kind of woman the world doesn't recognize right away, because she no longer moves for it. She doesn't speak to be admired. She doesn't share to be seen. She doesn't perform softness as a strategy or wield strength as a shield. She simply is. Fully, quietly, unapologetically. And that is what makes her unforgettable. Not because of how loud she is, but because of how little she needs to be loud. She has become the storm and the stillness, the silence and the sound, the ache and the answer. Once she made herself small so others could feel big. Once she over-explained, hoping that clarity would buy her compassion. Once she shaped herself into whatever the room needed, even if it left her hollow. But that woman has returned to ash. And from her dust rose someone else. Someone more ancient, more embodied, more complete. This woman doesn't chase fate. She attracts it. Through presence, through alignment, through the deep magnetic knowing of her own worth. Viktor Frankl wrote that we are not driven by pleasure, but by meaning. And when we cannot find meaning in the world, we are forced to forge it within. She has done this. She has forged meaning from heartbreak. She has carved grace from grief. She has turned silence into a sanctuary instead of a sentence. And in that sanctuary, she's learned the greatest truth of all. Not everyone who comes close deserves to stay close. Because she no longer sees people for their potential, she sees them for their patterns. She no longer attaches to words, she watches consistency. She no longer falls in love with dreams, she stands in love with reality. And the reality is, many could touch her body, but few could hold her soul. Fewer still could sit in her silence, that rich, vibrating silence that speaks louder than any confession. And so she walks alone sometimes. Not because she has to, but because she chooses to. Because she knows that peace isn't found in company. It's found in alignment. With truth, with values, with the deepest voice within her that no longer wants to be liked. It wants to be whole. She doesn't need fixing anymore. She doesn't need saving. She doesn't need a witness to validate the fire she's already walked through barefoot and burning. She simply needs herself. And that is no longer a need, it's a given. Because the moment she stopped outsourcing her safety, her value, her softness, everything shifted. She began to walk differently, talk differently, expect differently. And no, not everyone could handle her. Because people addicted to your weakness will call your healing a threat. People who fed on your chaos will call your calm cold. But she's no longer explaining herself to the unready. She is not cold, she is clear. She is not distant, she is discerning. She is not detached, she is devoted to what's true. Her standards are not walls, they are invitations. Her solitude is not absence, it is alchemy. And her silence? It's not the absence of words, it's the presence of self. The full, grounded, fierce self that she tried so long to find in others, only to discover it was waiting for her all along, beneath the noise. So now she lives in that silence. Not because she's lonely, because she is free. She no longer asks, will they stay? Because she now asks something far more powerful. Do I want them in the stillness I've fought to build? And that question changes everything. Because when you've tasted peace, not the performative kind, but the kind that comes from dying to old illusions, you stop negotiating it for companionship. You stop offering it up for brief moments of being seen. You stop letting people rent space in your soul just because they knock. Now she opens only to those who carry stillness within them. Those who come not to complete her, but to witness her. Not to distract her, but to join her. And it's rare, because most people are not comfortable with the kind of woman who no longer needs. They're drawn to her, yes, her calm, her depth, her magnetism. But they don't understand that she didn't become this woman by being loved. She became this woman by losing everything that made her forget who she was.
Frankl said, "Life is never made unbearable by circumstances, but only by lack of meaning and purpose." And this is her quiet rebellion. She has found purpose in her pain, not in suffering for its own sake, but in what the suffering taught her. It taught her to be selective with her energy, to trust the tension in her chest, to listen when her spirit whispered, "Leave before it costs your essence." It taught her that closure doesn't come from answers, it comes from boundaries. That love without safety isn't love, it's longing. That presence without consistency isn't connection, it's confusion. And so she stopped confusing being wanted with being respected. She stopped confusing being chosen with being safe. Now she wants something different. She wants slow, holy, quiet love. Love that doesn't require proof. Love that doesn't fear her strength or shrink from her softness. Love that feels like coming home, not like earning a place. But until that love arrives, she is in no rush, because she no longer sees being alone as absence. She sees it as abundance, a space where she pours into her soul, where she tends to the sacred garden she's grown inside herself, where she writes, moves, breathes, and rests without being touched by performance or perception. She is no longer the woman who hides her loneliness behind busyness. She is no longer the girl who chases presence to silence the ache of abandonment. She is solitude, made flesh. And those who fear that depth, she lets them leave. She blesses them in silence, because she now knows anyone who cannot sit in her quiet was never meant to hold her beauty. That beauty is not loud. It does not beg. It does not wear red flags like ribbons. It is soft. It is discerning. It is rooted. And it no longer shatters itself to be understood, because now she doesn't even need to understand them anymore. She understands herself. And that understanding is her freedom. It's in the way she doesn't over-explain. It's in the way she no longer calls people back into her life who closed the door with their silence. It's in the way she chooses her own presence over anyone else's confusion. And so the world may ask, why is she so distant? But they'll never understand the miles she walked in her own darkness just to feel whole. She is not distant. She is healed.
Some will say she changed, and they'll be right, but not in the way they mean. She didn't become colder. She became clearer. She didn't become distant. She became defined. She didn't lose her softness. She simply stopped offering it to those who saw it as weakness. This is what transformation looks like, not loud, not obvious, not celebrated, but felt. In her presence, in her posture, in the way she no longer lowers her voice, her worth, or her boundaries. Once she would have fought to explain, to clarify, to be understood, to prove her heart. Now, she simply leaves the room, not to punish, not to control, but because peace is no longer something she begs for, it's the place she returns to. Viktor Frankl once wrote, "What is to give light must endure burning." She is burned. Oh, how she is burned. She has endured the quiet agony of loving someone who didn't know how to hold her. She has endured the internal warfare of silencing her intuition just to keep a connection. She has endured the self-betrayal that comes from mistaking sacrifice for love. And from those ashes, she didn't just rise, she remembered who she was before the begging, before the bending, before the self-erasing. She remembered her value is not up for negotiation. She remembered her soul speaks in silence, and when that silence is interrupted by confusion or chaos, it's a sign she's being asked to shrink again. She doesn't shrink anymore, not even to keep the peace, because she now knows any peace that requires her to disappear is not peace at all. Her joy now is in the subtle things, waking up and not checking her phone for validation, walking alone and not feeling alone, being misunderstood and not chasing an opportunity to correct the narrative. Because she finally knows, the people who get her will not need an explanation. The people who see her will not need convincing. The people who stay, truly stay, will not require her to vanish for love. And if they don't, she lets them go. Not from bitterness, from belief. Belief in her own voice. Belief in the energy she protects. Belief in the fact that what is for her will recognize her without needing to wound her first. She doesn't need another person to complete her. She is not a puzzle. She is not a test. She is a temple. And temples are not places of proving. They are places of reverence. So if someone cannot enter her world barefoot, with honesty, humility, and sacred intention, they do not belong inside her heart. Because this heart has wept through betrayals that never got named. It has stayed open after doors slammed. It has trusted again even when it didn't make sense. And now? Now it is protected, not by walls, but by wisdom. Wisdom that says, I will not be everything to someone who doesn't even know how to hold one piece of me. Wisdom that says, my peace is not a reward, it's a birthright. Wisdom that says, I do not have to be louder to be worthy, I just have to be true. And she is. True even when it costs her popularity. True even when it makes her the one who walks away. True even when her softness gets misunderstood as disinterest, because the truth is, she's never been more present. She's just finally present for herself. There is a quiet revolution happening inside her, one the world may never see, but she feels it in every breath. It's in the way her body no longer flinches at the thought of solitude, in the way her heart no longer leaps for breadcrumbs, in the way her soul no longer aches for what once felt like home, but was really just a performance of love. She's not angry. She's not even sad. She's simply done. Done seeking warmth from cold hands. Done writing poetry for people who only ever read headlines. Done waiting for someone else to name her value when she already knows it by heart. This is not the kind of healing that earns applause. This is the kind of healing that frees you. She doesn't need to be impressive anymore. She just needs to be authentic. And authenticity is a language that only a few will speak, but she's no longer translating herself for the unlistening. Once she was fluent in survival. Now she speaks wholeness. Frankl wrote, between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. She lives in that space now. The space between memory and reaction, the space between expectation and response, the space between heartbreak and healing. That space, once filled with fear and old scripts, is now filled with choice. She chooses when to speak. She chooses when to walk away. She chooses when to feel without drowning, when to remember without reliving, when to stay without shrinking. And because she chooses, she is no longer controlled. Not by pain, not by people, not by the ghosts of who she once was. She no longer wears her pain like identity. She wears it like jewelry, visible, honest, but not defining. She does not hide her wounds, but they no longer bleed. They shine. They've become sacred reminders of the fire she walked through barefoot, holding only her breath and a stubborn belief that there must be more than this. There was. There is. She found it in the quiet, in the months no one saw, in the nights no one heard, in the decisions she made when no one clapped, no one stayed, and no one understood. That's when she met herself. Not the self they wanted her to be, not the self she performed to survive, but the one who waited in the shadows, the quiet woman beneath the masks. She no longer asks for forgiveness for choosing herself. She no longer apologizes for needing space, for saying no, for walking out when the energy turned violent, even if the words were sweet. She reads energy now, not promises. She watches actions now, not potential. She listens to her body now, not the scripts of old stories. And her body? It sighs with relief, because it knows she finally came home. She no longer needs someone else to call her worthy. She no longer needs a mirror to remind her of her beauty. She no longer craves noise to feel alive. Stillness is enough. And in that stillness, she finds everything she once thought she needed to chase: love, safety, meaning, self-respect. She doesn't need the last word anymore. She doesn't need to prove how deeply she cared. She doesn't need to hold up the mirror and beg someone to see themselves clearly. She simply holds her truth and walks, not in anger, but toward peace. Because now she finally knows the difference between abandonment and alignment. And she chooses alignment every time.
There's a kind of power that comes when a woman no longer needs to be seen to feel real, when she no longer asks, "Will they come back?" but instead whispers, "I didn't need them to stay." It's not denial. It's not coldness. It's clarity. The kind you earn, not the kind you're given. She used to measure her worth in mirrors held by other people's hands. She waited for someone to reflect her beauty back to her softness, her value. But mirrors crack, hands drop. People forget how to hold anything fragile, especially when they've never held themselves. So now she holds herself. And in doing so, she no longer needs to be reflected because she has become the light. Frankl understood the deep ache of invisibility, of being stripped of control, of losing everything you once called life. And yet he taught that even there, meaning could live. Even there, a choice remains. She has made hers. She chooses not to relive the wounds that once defined her. She chooses not to return to the stories where she was always waiting. She chooses to stop asking why they couldn't love her and starts asking why she ever thought she had to earn it. Because she's done with performance. She's done with emotional auditions, trying to prove she's worthy of love that doesn't require proof. Now she gives love freely, but with discernment. Not everyone deserves front-row access to a heart that has bled this much and still sings. She knows the cost of that song. She knows the long nights, the held-back texts, the unread journals, the therapy sessions that felt like unpeeling skin. She has paid in full. And so she no longer negotiates with people who show up half alive, asking her to light the fire and take the blame for the cold. She doesn't rescue anymore. She reflects. If someone is not ready to see themselves, they will call her mirror cruel. But she knows that is not her burden. She has her own healing to carry, and she carries it not as a cross, but as a torch, lighting her way, illuminating her choices, warming only those who can stand the heat of her honesty. Her silence now is not avoidance, it's devotion. To self, to presence, to the kind of stillness that sings lullabies to the nervous system. She no longer gets high on chaos. She no longer confuses adrenaline for attraction. She no longer mistakes drama for destiny. She has detoxed from the people who confused her softness for submission, from the relationships that taught her love was earned through exhaustion, from the belief that she had to fracture herself just to fit into someone else's arms. She now rests in one piece. That piece is enough. She is enough, without proving, without pushing, without being picked. She has picked herself, not in theory, but in practice, in the way she says no when her body tenses, in the way she walks away when her spirit flinches, and the way she lets herself want what she wants without guilt, without minimizing, without needing to justify. This is the life she was always meant to live, not one of shrinking, but of shining. Not one of waiting, but of walking. Not one of begging, but of belonging. First to herself, and then to the world.
And now, when she meets another, she no longer asks, "Will they love me?" She asks, "Can they sit in silence without filling it with fear?" Because the woman she's become does not fear silence. She trusts it. It is where she met herself. It is where she healed. It is where she finally remembered the deepest kind of love does not come from being chosen by someone else. It comes from choosing to never abandon yourself again. So now she moves through the world not looking to be saved, not asking to be seen, but anchored in her own soul, steady, silent, whole. The woman who once shattered for love now guards her peace like sacred fire. She has nothing left to prove, only space to protect. And when the world asks what changed, she smiles, not out of pride, but remembrance. The woman who found meaning in her silence no longer needed his validation.